I never imagined that a single glance across a crowded ballroom could unravel so many years of quiet ache. My name is Madeline Carter. If you met me at a bus stop, you might not look twice a woman in her 30s with a kind but tired smile, a boy's hand tucked inside hers. But for as long as I can remember, I've been learning how to live in the soft edges of other people's celebrations. I know the taste of secondhand applause, the sting of being a guest in a room that once belonged to me. Some families shine so brightly on the outside that no one ever suspects what happens when the doors close. Ours was a home of polished silver, sparkling wine, and laughter that never quite reached me. My mother, Valerie, is the kind of woman who fills a room with stories about her perfect girls, but somehow my own chapters never made it into the retelling. If you've ever felt invisible at your own family's table or stood at the edge of a party hoping no one would notice the empty chair beside you, then you already understand where my story begins. This is not a tragedy, though. It's the story of how the smallest acts of courage, sometimes just holding your ground, sometimes just holding your child, can change everything. I want to invite you to walk with me through a single evening that cracked my world wide open, and the lifetime of little moments that brought me there. I promise you this isn't about revenge or regret. It's about dignity, about choosing to stand in your own light even if the world prefers you in the shadows. And if you're listening because you too have ever wondered whether your voice matters, know this. Sometimes the bravest thing we do is simply stay and speak and love anyway. So let's begin not with the moment everything broke, but with all the quiet years that came before. The years I spent learning to blend in until life finally gave me no choice but to step out. When I was little, my world was defined by the echo of my mother's heels and the shimmer of my sister's laughter. Charlotte, 3 years younger and seemingly born for center stage, was the golden child in every sense. Her photographs lined the mantle, her trophies filled the shelves. Her name was always the first on everyone's lips. And me, I became expert at slipping between the cracks, collecting my own small victories in silence. I learned early that approval in our house was something you earned, not something you were given. My mother loved to recount Charlotte's ballet recitals to friends over wine, her voice swelling with pride, her hands fluttering in the air. If I brought home an A, the reply was a soft distracted, "That's nice, dear." If Charlotte so much as sneezed, there was a flurry of concern and hot soup. If I was sick, I learned to keep quiet and get better on my own. By the time I reached high school, I developed a quiet skill making myself useful but never indispensable. I washed dishes while the adults toasted, played peacekeeper when tempers flared. I made it easy for the world to overlook me, because deep down I believed that's what kept the peace. But shadows have a way of stretching. Over time, the little wounds accumulated: the birthday parties, where my invitations arrived late, the family vacations where my name was left off the luggage tags, the Christmas mornings when my gifts were practical, while Charlotte's shimmered beneath the tree. These were not the cruelties you could point to. They were quieter, woven into the fabric of every gathering, every holiday, every just joking remark that left me colder than before. Sometimes I would try to rebel, speak a little louder, laugh a little longer, show up in a dress that was just a bit too bright for the room. Sometimes it worked for a moment, but most days it was easier to play my part, the reliable one, the helper, the afterthought. Still beneath all of it, a small, stubborn voice kept whispering that I was worth more than a footnote in someone else's story. I just didn't know how to prove it yet. I grew up in the shadows of silk and champagne, always reaching for something soft to hold on to. And in the years that followed, that longing would shape every choice I made, from the love I clung to the dreams I quietly let slip away. But the thing about living in the background is that you see things other people miss. You learn to read the room, to sense the subtle shifts in mood, to spot the first tremors before an earthquake. All my life, I thought that was a weakness. I didn't realize it would become my greatest strength. And as I look back now, I see that the story didn't begin with humiliation in front of 100 guests. It began with every moment I chose kindness, every time I bit my tongue, every silent hope that someday someone might truly see me. Little did I know that someone would first have to be myself. They say the heart remembers the days when your whole life changes with a single sentence. For me, it was the morning I sat at the kitchen table, bare feet on cold tile sunlight slanting through faded curtains, and traced a shaking finger along the edges of a plastic pregnancy test. 2 pink lines. That was it. The world shifted under me quietly and forever. I was 25. Not old by any measure, but not nearly as certain as I had pretended to be. The man I loved, James, was kind in laughter, quick with dreams, but quicker still to vanish when reality set in. He was gone before the first ultrasound, his last words little more than a hurried apology left on my voicemail. There were no dramatic goodbyes, no slammed doors, just silence where his promises used to be. When I finally told my mother, Valerie, she stared at me as if I had announced the world was ending. She was furious, but even more, she was disappointed. Not in him, for that would have meant blaming a man, but in me, for ruining the family's reputation. Charlotte offered the kind of hug that's meant to look good in pictures. I learned then that disappointment could be colder than anger, and that silence could build higher walls than any argument. Those first months were a strange floating time part. Fear, part hope, part exhaustion so deep, it felt like living underwater. I worked the morning shift at the library, checked books in and out, shelved stories I barely had time to read. At night, I sold pastries and coffee at a bakery downtown, counting out tips in the small hours while my feet ached and my belly grew. Each day was measured in steps, taken bills paid, and tiny kicks beneath my ribs. There were moments I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake. Nights when I stared at the ceiling and asked myself whether love was enough love for a child I hadn't met, love that would have to fill the spaces left by everyone else. But in the quiet, I always found a little strength left for tomorrow. I sang to my unborn son as I walked home under city lights. I kept a notebook of hopes for him, small practical wishes that he would be kind, that he would laugh freely, that he would never feel invisible. When Mason arrived, tiny and red-faced and more beautiful than anything I'd imagined, every cruel word I'd carried from my family became background noise. His first breath was a second chance. In that hospital room, I made a promise to him and to myself. I would never let him feel unwanted, not for a single day. Life as a single mother was not the scandal my mother warned me about. It was instead a quiet kind of heroism unseen by most, measured in the smallest victories. I learned how to swaddle with one hand, how to make a bottle while half asleep, how to stretch $1 so Mason never saw my worry. He grew up on thrift store adventures, bedtime stories spun from thin air, and pancakes for dinner on long weeks when the budget ran thin. There were days I felt the weight of it all, the exhaustion that seeped into my bones, the loneliness that lingered after Mason fell asleep. There were parent-teacher nights where my name was misspelled, holiday parties, where I was the only mom without a partner. Sometimes when other parents whispered about me, I'd let their voices echo just long enough to sting, but then Mason would run to me arms wide, proud of the spelling bee he'd won, or the drawing he made just for me. And all at once, I was full again. I remember one Saturday in early spring. We had nothing planned, no money for outings, no family birthday to attend, just a day together. Mason begged to go to the park, so we packed peanut butter sandwiches and set out. He raced ahead on the grass, his laughter bright as birdsong. And for a moment, I watched him and realized that this simple joy was enough. That I wasn't just managing, I was building a childhood. He would remember, for love, not lack. But even on good days, the ache of not belonging would creep in. Birthday cards from my family came late, if at all. Charlotte sent photos of glamorous vacations, always with a perfect smile, always with captions about family first. Valerie left voicemails when she needed to remind me of some obligation, never to check in, only to keep up appearances. I saw them at holidays sitting together at the big table while Mason and I took our usual spots at the far end. If anyone noticed, they never said, "Sister, one Thanksgiving." Mason asked me quietly why Nana didn't sit with us. I told him that sometimes grown-ups forget what matters. He nodded wise beyond his years and offered me half his role. It was a small gesture, but one that meant more to me than any toast or speech at the head table. I learned with time that love is an action, not a title. It's the way you show up even when it's hard. It's the way you listen when the world wants to talk over you. Mason taught me that. He showed me every day that I was enough, not because I was perfect, but because I stayed. There are so many mothers in the world who build their families from courage instead of convention, who learn to make a home out of resilience. For a long time, I was ashamed of my story, of not fitting the mold, of having to work twice as hard for half as much. But as Mason grew, and as I watched him become thoughtful and kind, I began to realize that maybe my story wasn't one of failure at all. Maybe I thought second-class love is only second-class if you let someone else decide its worth. If there's a lesson in those years, it's this. We can't choose the family we're born into, but we can choose the family we build moment by moment, act by act. I stopped waiting for my mother's approval, stopped measuring myself against Charlotte's highlight reel. I learned to take pride in the life I was building and to trust that Mason's laughter meant more than anyone's opinion ever could. Still, a part of me hoped that someday things would be different, that my family might see me not as a cautionary tale, but as someone worth loving, simply because I was there. So when Charlotte's wedding invitation arrived in the mail, a thick envelope embossed with gold, my name misspelled, but still included, I hesitated. I stood by the window, Mason spinning circles on the rug behind me, and wondered what kind of closure I was really seeking. Maybe I thought this was my chance to show up for myself, to stand where everyone could see me and refuse to shrink. Maybe I could walk into that ballroom and prove that second-class love could hold its head high too. As I smoothed the invitation on the counter, the sunlight catching its elegant script, I felt something shift inside me. A quiet, stubborn hope, stubborn enough to believe that even in a room full of ghosts, I still had the right to take up space. And so, with Mason by my side, I began to prepare for a night that would test everything I'd learned about courage, belonging, and the power of showing up. Little did I know it would be a night that changed not just how my family saw me, but how I finally saw myself. There's a particular kind of anticipation that builds in the days before a family wedding. For some, it's excitement picking out the perfect dress, practicing dance steps in the kitchen, dreaming about reunions and laughter echoing across tables. For me, anticipation meant knots in my stomach, rehearsed small talk in the mirror, and long phone calls with Naomi, the friend who never forgot to ask if I was truly okay. Charlotte's wedding felt in every way like an event staged for an audience much larger than our family. The invitations were glossy and thick names etched in gold. The venue, a grand hotel in the city's historic district, was the kind of place where even the air seemed to shimmer with old money and new expectations. I could almost hear my mother's voice as I flipped through the event details. We only get one chance to do this right. For Valerie, this wedding was more than a marriage. It was a pageant, a parade, a second chance at a legacy she never felt secure about. Mason was excited in the way only children can be. He asked questions about tuxedos and cake, wondered if he'd get to dance, practiced his bow tie in front of the bathroom mirror until it was slightly frayed. I watched him with a bittersweet pride, loving how easily he believed in fairy tales and happy endings, wishing I could shield him from the sharp edges that sometimes hid beneath the surface of a celebration. For weeks, I scoured consignment stores for something special, to wear something elegant but affordable, something that wouldn't stand out for the wrong reasons. In the end, I found a navy blue dress with delicate beading along the collar, the sort of dress that made me feel quietly brave. Naomi insisted on coming over the morning of the wedding to help me with my hair. She brought coffee and the gift of easy laughter, grounding me when my nerves threatened to take over. "Remember," she said, smoothing a stubborn curl behind my ear, "you don't owe anyone an apology for being here." Her words settled around me like a shield. The day of the wedding arrived with the kind of relentless sunshine that made everything look more vivid. Mason's little suit was slightly too big, but he wore it with a solemn pride, taking my hand as we walked toward the hotel's ornate doors. I could feel the pulse of music, the hum of conversation, the undercurrent of expectation. Inside the space was transformed white roses along every banister, crystal glasses at every table, gold accents glinting beneath the chandeliers. It was beautiful, almost breathtaking, but it felt like entering a world that wasn't built for me. Charlotte greeted us with a practiced smile at the reception line, her dress shimmering, every hair in place. She leaned in just enough to avoid smudging her makeup, complimented Mason's tie, then turned away to greet another guest. Her joy was effortless on display for every camera flash, every whispered compliment. Valerie floated beside her, beaming arms outstretched for friends, old colleagues, anyone who could reinforce the image of a perfect family. When it was my turn to approach, my mother's eyes flicked over me, assessing cataloging, pausing just a beat too long on my thrifted dress. She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I see you made it," she said, then quickly moved on. No hug, no warmth, just the smooth efficiency of a woman who has too much to manage and little time for outliers. We found our names on a small card table 12, tucked near the back of the room closest to the restrooms. Mason didn't notice busy tracing the pattern of gold leaves on his napkin, but I felt the ache of exclusion settle across my shoulders. I smiled anyway, because that's what you do. You smile and keep your chin high, especially for your child. As guests filled the room, I recognized faces from old family photos, some I hadn't seen since childhood. There were polite nods, brief comments about how much Mason had grown, and the occasional question that stung more than it should have. "Are you here alone?" Or "No plus one this time?" I answered with practiced ease, but inside I counted the minutes until I could retreat to the quiet of the parking lot. Still, there were moments of sweetness, the way Mason giggled when he tried sparkling water for the first time, how Naomi texted jokes from 2 tables over, and the unexpected warmth from Mrs. Hargrove, an elderly guest who squeezed my hand and whispered, "You belong here just as much as anyone." It was a simple kindness, but it lingered long after. The ceremony itself was a blur of soft music sunlight through stained glass and Charlotte's perfect smile. I watched her and Ethan exchange vows, wondered what it must feel like to stand at the center of so much approval. The applause was thunderous. Tears flowed on cue, and I clapped truly, wishing her happiness even as I felt the edges of my own life shrink a little smaller. At the reception, the sense of theater deepened. Every moment was choreographed, the father-daughter dance, the speeches, the perfectly timed laughter. I moved through the crowd like a shadow helping Mason cut his chicken, taking quiet comfort in his delight at the dessert table. All around me, conversations sparkled and faded, old stories revived and retold, none of them mine. It struck me how much effort goes into creating the appearance of closeness, even as so many sit together and feel worlds apart. In a country where family gatherings are supposed to be celebrations, how many people like me, like you, perhaps find themselves scanning the room for one genuine smile, one invitation to the center? At one point, Mason tugged at my sleeve, eyes wide, as he watched Charlotte on the dance floor. "Mom, do you think Aunt Charlotte's happy?" he asked. I considered the question, glancing at my sister's perfect posture, the way she laughed too loudly, checking for approval in the faces around her. "I think she's trying very hard to be," I answered honestly. Sometimes that's the hardest part. Looking back, I see now that the wedding wasn't really about love or unity. It was a carefully constructed stage. Each role rehearsed, each spotlight directed. The family I'd grown up with had become more concerned with looking whole than being whole. And in that room filled with music and flowers and too many unsaid words, I realized just how long I'd been playing along. There's a lesson there, I think, for anyone who has ever been cast as the outsider in their own story. Sometimes the more you try to fit in, the more you lose touch with what makes you whole in the first place. Yet, as the night unfolded and the time for speeches drew near, I found myself sitting a little straighter, holding Mason's hand just a bit tighter. Maybe it was Naomi's encouragement or Mrs. Hargrove's quiet support, or maybe it was simply the result of all those years learning how to endure. Whatever it was, I felt something begin to change inside me. A quiet resolve to claim my place, even if no one handed me an invitation. Because sometimes the greatest act of courage isn't standing in the spotlight. Sometimes it's refusing to disappear when the lights grow brightest. And so as the music faded and the room quieted for the toasts, I knew deep down that whatever happened next, I would face it without shrinking. For Mason, for myself, and for every person who's ever been told in 100 small ways that they were only a supporting character in someone else's celebration. The stage was set, the lights were warm, and as I listened for my name to be called, I promised myself this time I wouldn't look away. You'd be surprised how many small wounds a person can carry without ever letting them show. They say the big betrayals are the hardest to forgive, but sometimes it's the 100 tiny cuts. The sideways looks, the careless jokes, the way a name is said, or not said at all, that really settled under the skin. The night of Charlotte's wedding, I became more aware than ever of the slow accumulation of those wounds. In a room filled with laughter and music, I saw how easily someone can be set apart not by open hostility, but by the quiet drip of 1,000 minor slights. From the moment Mason and I found our seats at table 12, the signs were subtle but unmistakable. There was the place card, my name spelled Madeline, a version no one in my family had ever called me. There was the distance from the main table, the proximity to the swinging kitchen doors, and the less than glamorous view of the waitstaff bustling in and out. I tried to brush it off, smiling for Mason's sake, but I felt the old familiar ache of being almost included, but never truly at home. At our table, conversation was polite but shallow. One woman, someone from Charlotte's work, I think, asked, "So are you Charlotte's cousin?" When I explained, she blinked, then covered her surprise with a tight smile. Oh, I didn't realize Charlotte had an older sister. The implication hung in the air. I was the hidden chapter in a family story everyone thought they already knew. Mason, oblivious, chattered about the cake and tried to guess how many roses were in the centerpiece. Across the room, Charlotte glided from guest to guest, never glancing in my direction. Valerie was in her element, orchestrating toasts and ushering important people to the photo backdrop. Occasionally, she'd look my way just long enough to check that I was presentable, never long enough to offer a real smile. Microaggressions have a way of piling up over the course of an evening. A family friend approached her voice. Honey Sweet still working at the library. Dear, such a noble calling for a woman on her own. Her eyes slid quickly to Mason, then back to me, assessing as if searching for proof of some invisible flaw. I responded with a practiced cheerfulness, but inside I felt the familiar sting of her assumption single must mean sad working class, must mean unfulfilled. As the night unfolded, I found myself shrinking. Shoulders tight voice, softer laughter, more cautious. I excused myself to help Mason with his napkin, then to the restroom, then to retrieve an extra fork. Each small errand was a chance to breathe, to collect myself, to try and let the little hurts slide off before they could settle in too deep. I remembered other occasions, Easter brunches, where my name was missing from the place cards, graduation parties, where I took the group photo instead of being in it. Over time, these things start to feel normal, like the tax you pay for not fitting the family mold. It's easy to believe these slights are harmless, just awkward moments, just jokes, just people being thoughtless. But for those on the receiving end, they can become the backdrop of every family event, an invisible weight you carry from room to room. I realized that night how often I taught myself to excuse these things. It doesn't really matter. They don't mean any harm. I'm just sensitive. But the truth is, these little cuts shape the way you see yourself, teaching you to expect less, to ask for less, to settle for less than you deserve. There was a moment midway through dinner when Mason tugged my sleeve. He wanted to go say hello to Charlotte. I hesitated, unsure whether we'd be welcome, but he was insistent, his hope unspoiled by years of being sidelined. We walked over together. Charlotte was surrounded by friends, her laughter bright, her dress sparkling. She turned her eyes flickering briefly to Mason, then to me. Oh, Madeline. I didn't see you there, she said, the words landing with a strange chill. Mason held up the drawing he'd made for her, a little cartoon bride with a crown of flowers. Charlotte took it, her smile stiff. That's sweet. Thanks, Mason, she said, already turning back to her friends. I squeezed Mason's hand, feeling his confusion, wanting to shield him from the subtle ways love can be withheld. Back at our table, I found Mrs. Hargrove waiting. She gave me a look full of kindness, as if she'd seen the whole exchange. Sometimes, she said quietly, it's the people on the margins who see what's really happening at the center. I nodded, grateful for her warmth. We talked for a while about her late husband, about raising children, about how every family has its secrets and its silences. Her presence steadied me, reminding me that I wasn't entirely invisible, not to everyone. The lesson I took from that evening was sharper than I expected. Belonging isn't about being tolerated or even accepted by those who refuse to see you. It's about knowing your worth regardless of where you're seated or how your name appears on a card. Microaggressions only have the power we let them steal from us. I wished I'd learned that sooner, wished I could give that certainty to Mason so he would never doubt his place at any table. Still, as the night wore on and the speeches approached, I felt a slow resolve building. I could not change my family's patterns nor erase the years of being sidelined. But I could choose to show up anyway, not for their approval, but for my own sense of dignity, and for Mason's sense of what it means to persist in the face of quiet cruelty. As the music faded and the sound of clinking glasses gave way to the first toast, I sat a little taller. I remembered Naomi's words from that morning, the fierce way she'd said, "You belong here." I held on to that, letting it fill the spaces left empty by all the little hurts. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay. Sometimes dignity is choosing not to disappear even when others would find it easier if you did. I looked at Mason, who smiled up at me, unbothered by grown-up dramas, believing in magic and new beginnings. For his sake and for mine, I would not let them decide my story for me. The master of ceremonies called for everyone's attention. Champagne glasses were raised, laughter hushed the spotlight swinging toward the head table. The time for speeches had come, a moment I'd learned to brace for, a moment that would soon become something none of us could have predicted. And as the room quieted, I knew the next few minutes would be the test, not just of my patience, but of everything I'd learned about what it means to hold your head high, even in the face of 100 tiny cuts. The moment before a speech at a wedding is always thick with expectation. A collective breath, held eyes glancing at the stage guests, wondering if the next words will make them laugh or cry. At Charlotte's wedding, the air shimmered with more than hope. There was something sharper, a sense that what came next might tip the delicate balance of the whole night. It began as these things do with charm. The best man took the microphone, first spinning stories about Ethan's college years, the wild misadventures that now seemed tame in the glow of adulthood. Laughter rippled around the room, easy and warm. The first maid of honor followed, her voice trembling with emotion as she described growing up with Charlotte, the secrets they shared, the dreams they confessed. People dabbed at their eyes, raising their glasses to the perfect couple at the center of it all. Then it was Charlotte's turn. She stood graceful, poised, radiant in her wedding gown. Her voice, practiced and clear, floated across the ballroom. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "It means the world to have so many loved ones here. For the happiest day of my life." There was a hush of admiration, cameras lifted to capture every word. And of course, I have to say something special about my big sister Madeline. She smiled, and for a moment my heart stumbled. I dared to hope maybe, just maybe, kindness would find me at last. Charlotte continued, her tone light, her eyes glinting with a secret. "Maddie has always been a role model for me, a single mom, strong, independent, and apparently not wanted by anyone else." Laughter erupted, loud, unchecked, the kind that swells when people are relieved it's not about them. My cheeks burned as I tried to process the joke. Was this what she'd saved for the biggest night of her life? I glanced at Mason. His smile had vanished, replaced by confusion and hurt. He leaned closer, his small voice barely audible. "Why did Aunt Charlotte say that about you, Mom?" Before I could find an answer, Valerie's voice cut through the room, crisp as glass. "Oh, darling, she's a used product, but she still polishes up well." The laughter sharpened, bouncing around the tables, building on itself. I saw faces, some embarrassed, some amused, some just eager not to meet my eyes. Even Mr. Carter, my grandfather, stared at his plate, his hands shaking ever so slightly as he folded and refolded his napkin. In that moment, time seemed to stretch. I could hear every sound in the room, the chime of a dropped fork, the muffled gasp of someone who thought the joke went too far, the nervous shifting of chairs. It was the kind of laughter that isn't really about humor at all, but about power. The power to put someone in their place, to remind them, and everyone else, who is center stage and who is meant for the wings. There is a specific pain that comes from being humiliated in public by your own family, a pain that doesn't announce itself with drama, but with a quiet, suffocating shame. I wanted to disappear, to shrink into the upholstery, to take Mason by the hand and leave without a backward glance. But then I saw his face, bewildered cheeks, flushed eyes full of questions, and I realized that if I vanished now, the lesson he'd carry was not about dignity, but about defeat. I thought of all the times I'd stayed silent to keep the peace, all the moments I'd swallowed pain so Mason would never have to see me wounded. I had believed for years that endurance was the bravest thing a person could do, but in that instant, I saw that there was a deeper kind of courage, the courage to stay visible, to refuse to shrink even when every instinct screamed otherwise. Across the table, a few guests exchanged uneasy glances. Naomi at the far end looked at me with such fierce sympathy, I could almost feel her hand in mine. Mrs. Hargrove shook her head quietly, her lips pressed in a line of disapproval. But most guests just laughed because laughter is safer than confrontation, because to challenge cruelty is to risk being its next target. This was not the first time I'd been the punchline in my own family. There had been birthdays where my achievements were dismissed as cute holidays, where I was invited late, always the last to know the plan. I used to believe that if I just worked harder, loved better, gave more, I'd finally earn my place. But watching Mason try to make sense of his mother's humiliation, I understood at last some people would always see me as a lesson, not a person, and that was their loss, not mine. As the laughter faded and the next speech began, the spell of shame started to lift. Mason squeezed my hand, searching my eyes for reassurance. I forced a smile for him, but inside a new resolve was blooming. I would not let my family write the ending to my story. I would not let Mason think that the loudest voice always wins, or that love is measured by who can wound the deepest. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I barely tasted the food, barely registered the music or the clinking of glasses. My only anchor was Mason, his gentle presence, his trust that I would make things right. The ballroom had turned cold, the celebration hollowed out by the sharp edge of Charlotte's joke. I wondered how many other people in that room had felt at one time or another, just as small, just as unseen. As the dancing began and the lights dimmed, I found myself at the edge of the room watching Mason twirl with another child, his laughter returning in small tentative bursts. I realized then that survival is not always about strength or wit, or even grace. Sometimes it's about endurance, the ability to stay standing when others want you to disappear. The lesson that night was as simple as it was hard. You cannot make people kinder by shrinking yourself. You cannot win acceptance by laughing along with your own humiliation. Dignity. I discovered is a gift you give yourself often in the quiet aftermath of someone else's cruelty. And so, as the evening wore on and the party wound down, I made a quiet promise to myself and to Mason. We would leave when we were ready, with our heads held high, not as victims, but as people who had learned the value of their own worth. The words spoken that night could not define us. Only our actions could do that. Unbeknownst to me, a reckoning was already stirring in the heart of the ballroom. The next moments, ones I could never have predicted, would show Mason and everyone else what true courage looked like. Sometimes when a family turns into a crowd of strangers, it only takes one unexpected voice to bring the truth roaring back into the light. There are moments in life when the air itself seems to change, a subtle shift, like the sudden hush before a summer storm. That's how it felt in the ballroom right after Charlotte's speech faded and the laughter began to dissolve. The party was supposed to surge forward, but something in the room had broken a fragile thread, snapping in the space between applause and discomfort. For a few long seconds, I focused on Mason, who clung to my arm and watched the grown-ups with searching eyes. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him everything was okay, but the words wouldn't come. I could see Naomi at her table, her expression a mix of outrage and worry, while Mrs. Hargrove gave Charlotte a look that could cut glass. Around us, conversations faltered. The next speaker hesitated. It was as if everyone was waiting for someone else to break the spell. Then out of the silence, I heard a chair scrape sharply against the polished floor. Ethan, Charlotte's new husband, the man who until this moment had played his part with a kind smile and careful detachment, stood up. He didn't look at Charlotte or Valerie or the guests. Instead, he fixed his gaze on me and the room seemed to freeze. "Excuse me," Ethan said, his voice steady but unusually low, carrying across the crowd. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Charlotte turned a nervous smile, twitching at her lips, expecting perhaps another gentle joke or a toast to smooth things over. But Ethan didn't oblige. "I know we're all here to celebrate," he began, "but I can't stand by and let what just happened go unaddressed." His words landed like pebbles in a still pond. "This isn't a tradition. This isn't family humor. It's cruelty dressed up as a joke, and I don't think it's funny." There was a collective intake of breath, a rustle of surprise. A few guests looked away embarrassed, others sat forward suddenly alert. Ethan continued, his voice unwavering. "Madeline came here tonight with her son Mason. She came here knowing it wouldn't be easy, but wanting to show her love for this family. She's never asked for sympathy, never asked for a spotlight. But to turn her story and her strength into a punchline for our entertainment, that's not the kind of family I want to celebrate." It was as if the room had shrunk to just a handful of people, the ones who understood the weight of what was being said, and the ones who wished the ground would swallow them up. Valerie's face darkened, her composure slipping. Charlotte tried to laugh it off. "Ethan, honey, it was just a bit of fun," but Ethan raised a hand gently but firmly, stopping her. "I've heard a lot about appearances this past year," he said, looking straight at Valerie now, "about keeping up traditions, about representing the Carter name. But what I saw tonight wasn't tradition. It was mockery. And I don't want to start my marriage pretending that's okay." There was a strange electric silence, the kind that comes right before something shifts forever. I could feel my heart pounding, not with shame this time, but with something that felt dangerously close to hope. Ethan turned back to Mason, crouching so they were eye to eye. "Mason," he said, his tone gentle, "your mom is the bravest person in this room. You should be proud of her." "I know I am." Mason nodded, wide-eyed, clutching my hand even tighter. For the first time all night, I saw pride flicker in his face instead of confusion. Across the room, a few guests began to clap hesitantly at first, then with more conviction. Mrs. Hargrove wiped a tear from her cheek. Naomi caught my eye and mouthed, Yes. Even Mr. Carter, my grandfather, looked up and nodded a small, sad smile ghosting across his lips. Ethan straightened and looked at Charlotte. I love you, he said softly, but I won't build our future on top of someone else's pain. If that's the family you want, then maybe I'm not the right person to be standing beside you tonight. It was a reckoning, gentle but immovable, the kind that doesn't need to shout to make its meaning clear. Charlotte stood frozen, her mask slipping, unsure whether to fight or flee. Valerie sputtered, "How dare you embarrass us on this night?" But even her words felt empty, echoing back to her with none of their usual power. The lesson that unfurled in that quiet chaos was one I'd never witnessed so clearly. Sometimes it takes an outsider to break the cycle, to say aloud what everyone else is too afraid to name. Ethan hadn't been raised with the Carter traditions. He hadn't learned to overlook the little cruelties or to laugh along just to keep the peace. He saw something wrong and chose publicly, courageously to call it out. There was a time not so long ago when I would have wanted to disappear in a moment like this. But as I watched Ethan, as I felt Mason's small hand in mine, I realized how much power there is in a single voice raised on behalf of another. It doesn't have to be loud or eloquent, it just has to be honest. After Ethan set the microphone down, the spell was broken. The room was no longer united in easy laughter. Instead, there was discomfort, but also a kind of quiet relief. Some guests avoided my gaze, ashamed by their earlier laughter. Others approached me quietly, offering words of support, small apologies, or a simple squeeze of the shoulder. It wasn't everything I'd ever wanted from my family, but it was enough to know that I was seen, that I mattered. As the evening wound down, I sat beside Mason, letting the event settle over me like the first soft rain after a drought. I thought about how long I'd waited for anyone to stand up for me, never realizing I might be worth that effort. I thought too about the courage it takes to be the first to speak and the courage it takes to accept that help when it finally arrives. The lesson I carried from that night was twofold. First, that silence can be just as harmful as cruelty, and second, that the people who truly belong in your life will never ask you to laugh at your own expense. Sometimes the bravest act is to say enough, and sometimes, if you're lucky, someone will say it for you. As Mason drifted to sleep in the car on the way home, I promised myself I would remember this moment, not for the pain, but for the clarity it brought. No more shrinking, no more apologies for simply existing. If Ethan could risk everything to speak the truth, then maybe I could risk believing I was worth defending. The night had started as a performance, but it ended in an unexpected reckoning. And while the fallout was only just beginning, I felt for the first time that the story was finally turning toward honesty, toward dignity, toward a future that might at last include a place for me. There's a strange quiet that settles after a reckoning. It's not the soft hush of peace, but the brittle silence that comes when people realize the rules have changed and no one quite knows what to do next. After Ethan's speech echoed through the grand ballroom, the air in the room felt thinner, stripped of its old certainty. For a moment, it seemed like no one wanted to be the first to move, as if shifting in their seats might shatter the fragile calm and start something none of them could control. As the clapping died away and Ethan's figure retreated from the stage, Charlotte remained frozen at the head table, her posture perfect, but her expression shell-shocked. Valerie, always so quick to regain her composure for once, had no clever retort. She glared at Ethan's empty seat, then at me, as if searching for some thread to pull the family's image back together. But the spell of control had been broken, and she couldn't put it back. I gathered my things quietly, tucking Mason's jacket over his shoulders as he blinked up at me, exhaustion and confusion warring in his eyes. Naomi found us near the door, her hug fierce and full of unsaid things. "You did nothing wrong," she whispered, and I believed her. Across the room, Mrs. Hargrove approached with slow, careful steps. She pressed my hand in hers. "Some things needed to be said, Madeline. It's about time she told me," and her gaze was steady with kindness. Not everyone shared that sentiment. Some guests averted their eyes as we passed, their faces a collage of guilt and discomfort. A few offered stiff smiles, unsure if they should say something or if saying nothing would hurt less. In every family, there are those who choose silence not out of malice, but out of habit or fear. That night, I understood better than ever how heavy silence can be and how easily it becomes a wall. As we made our way toward the exit, my grandfather George rose slowly from his table. He'd been quiet all night, a distant presence, but now he moved with purpose. He took my hand, his own trembling just a bit, and said softly, "I'm sorry, Madeline. I should have spoken up years ago. There was regret in his eyes, old and deep, but also a flicker of hope that things could still change even if the cost was high. I squeezed his hand, forgiving him with a nod, understanding that some wounds are too old to mend but not too old to acknowledge. In the hallway outside the ballroom, the city night felt fresh and cool against my skin. I breathed in deeply, Mason leaning against me, his trust a weight and a gift. I wondered what stories he'd remember about this night, whether the laughter would overshadow the courage, or if the love from friends and a few brave souls would be what stayed with him. Children remember what matters, not always what hurts. It was my job to make sure he knew the difference. On the ride home, Mason was quiet at first, his head resting on my shoulder as the city lights blurred past. "Mom, did I do something wrong?" he finally asked. My heart clenched at his question, the echo of every time I'd wondered the same thing growing up. "No, sweetheart," I assured him, stroking his hair. "None of this was your fault. Sometimes people say hurtful things because they're unhappy or afraid. But it's never wrong to be yourself or to show up even when it's hard." That's the lesson I tried to teach him and myself that night. True family is not defined by blood or tradition, but by those who choose to stand beside you when it matters most. Sometimes the people who remain silent do so out of fear, but sometimes the quietest among us can also find the courage to speak. It doesn't always come in grand speeches. Sometimes it's a hand on your shoulder, a whispered word, the presence of a friend who doesn't let you walk away alone. In the days that followed, the fallout rippled through our lives in ways both expected and surprising. Valerie left voicemails first, angry, then pleading, then coldly polite, as if hoping to restore order through sheer force of habit. Charlotte retreated, her social media going dark, her friends whispering behind her back. A few guests reached out to me, their messages tentative but sincere. Some apologized for their laughter, others offered support, and a few simply wanted me to know they were thinking of Mason and me. Naomi became my anchor, dropping by with coffee, bringing Mason books and small treats. She reminded me again and again that one act of courage, Ethan's mine, even Mason's in his own way, could change the shape of a family, even if it wasn't the change we expected. "You get to choose who you let close, Madeline," she said one afternoon, as we watched Mason build a tower of blocks. "You get to decide which voices matter now." For the first time in years, I let myself believe that was true. The old rules had been broken. The bonds of obligation that kept me tethered to people who couldn't see me for who I was, those were weaker now, easier to step away from. In the quiet aftermath, I found space to breathe, to dream, even to forgive, not because the pain had vanished, but because I finally understood its limits. It wasn't easy. There were moments of loneliness, nights when I lay awake replaying every word, wondering if I could have done more or less or simply disappeared. But each morning, Mason woke with hope, ready to start again. Children are resilient, and in his resilience, I found my own. I also learned that forgiveness doesn't mean returning to what hurt you. Sometimes forgiveness is simply letting go, making room for the life that waits beyond old wounds. It's a lesson I wished I'd learned sooner, but one I was determined to teach Mason as we built our days together, one gentle, brave step at a time. The family I'd known was fractured now, but something new was forming in the spaces left behind, a circle of real belonging, made up of those who stood up, those who stayed, and those who finally spoke. I saw now that you can't always count on people to be who you want them to be, but you can choose how you show up for yourself and for the ones who truly matter. As the world moved on and the wedding faded into memory, the next chapter was already beginning. I didn't know yet what forgiveness or healing would look like for our family, or how far the ripples would reach. But I did know that the storm had cleared the air, and in the silence that followed, I was free at last to decide who I wanted to become. And as I watched Mason laugh in the golden light of a new day, I realized that sometimes it takes losing what you thought was home to finally start building one of your own. Some stories end at the edge of a family's silence. Mine unexpectedly found new life in the loud, unruly world beyond. In the days after the wedding, I expected the memories to fade, as they always had, discomfort softening into habit, old wounds returning to their familiar shadows. But this time something different happened. This time the truth had witnesses. I found out first from Naomi. She showed up on my doorstep early Monday morning, her eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and fierce pride. "You need to see this," she said, thrusting her phone into my hands. There on the glowing screen was a video, shaky but unmistakable. Ethan standing in the spotlight, speaking for me, for Mason, for anyone who'd ever been laughed at and left to endure alone. The video had been posted by a guest, and in a matter of hours, it spread far beyond the confines of our family. The views climbed into the thousands, then tens of thousands, then more. Comments poured in, some from strangers, others from people who recognized the pain behind the smile. "This made me cry," one wrote. "Every single mom deserves someone like Ethan in her corner." Another, "This is what real courage looks like." There were stories, too, of other weddings, other families, other moments when someone finally spoke up. At first, I wasn't sure how to feel. Relief mingled with vulnerability. The humiliation of that night was no longer private, no longer a secret carried only by Mason and me. Now everyone could see the cracks in the family I'd spent so long trying to hold together. For a moment, I panicked, wondering what my mother would say, how Charlotte would spin the story, how the world might judge us. But something unexpected happened as the hours passed. For every unkind comment, there were dozens more that offered compassion. Strangers reached out to share their own experiences, their own memories of being the punchline or the afterthought. They spoke of healing, of hard-earned dignity, of the freedom that comes when you finally stop pretending everything is fine. "You're not alone," they said again and again. And for the first time in years, I believed it. Of course, not every voice was kind. There were the usual critics, people who accused Ethan of ruining the wedding, who blamed me for airing dirty laundry, who saw in our pain an opportunity for gossip or outrage. Valerie unsurprisingly left angry messages on my phone. "You've embarrassed us all," she hissed. "This should have stayed in the family." But even her anger felt smaller now, dwarfed by the chorus of people who had seen the truth and refused to look away. For Mason, the aftermath was confusing at first. He didn't understand why people were talking about his mom on the internet, why some faces at school seemed friendlier while others turned away. One afternoon, he came home holding a note from a classmate. Just 4 words: "Your mom is brave." He tucked it into the same box where he kept his drawings and little treasures, a quiet validation he could hold in his hands. I realized then that this unexpected wave of attention was a lesson in itself. Community can heal, but it can also overwhelm. Support can feel like sunlight or like a spotlight, depending on how ready you are to stand in it. For every new friend who reached out, there was a moment when I wanted to retreat back into the comfort of anonymity, back into the belief that keeping your head down is always safer. But that's not the world we live in anymore. Stories travel fast, and pain has a way of echoing until someone names it. For years, I thought I was alone in my quiet endurance. The flood of messages proved otherwise. Some wrote to thank me for not hiding. Others asked for advice on what to do when the people who should protect you choose to laugh instead. I answered when I could, sharing what I'd learned, that you can't force anyone to see your worth, but you can decide every day to act like you deserve to be seen. Naomi was a constant through it all, screening the worst of the comments, bringing humor when things felt heavy. "Internet fame suits you," she teased. "Just promise me you won't start selling miracle diets or writing tell-all memoirs." We laughed, grateful for the absurdity, for the way even pain could be softened by someone willing to share it. And still, the messages came. Some were from women my mother's age, quietly confessing regrets about daughters they hadn't understood, apologies they'd never given. Some were from fathers who had been silent too long, who wished they'd spoken up the way Ethan had. The world, it turned out, was full of people waiting for permission to be braver, to love louder, to risk the discomfort of truth. As the video's reach grew, the story changed. It wasn't just about one night or one family. It became a conversation about the little ways we hurt each other, about the big ways we choose to heal. The hashtags trended for a day or two. Stand with Madeline, Josh, family, Izzy's family does. And then as the internet does, the world moved on to the next thing. But for me and for Mason, the ripples remained. The lesson in all this was clearer than I expected. Justice, I learned, is rarely clean or simple. Sometimes it comes not as retribution, but as recognition, the quiet validation that comes when someone somewhere finally says, "I see you." What happened was wrong. Sometimes justice is a stranger's kindness, sometimes it's an apology from someone you never thought would give one. There is a danger, too, in letting the world define your story. The temptation to perform, to let yourself become a symbol, to trade your own healing for a moment of collective outrage. I learned to step back, to turn off the phone, to remind myself that true justice is found in the small moments, Making breakfast for Mason, calling Naomi just to talk, finding peace in the fact that I had survived and grown stronger. The family I was born into had fractured, but the family I was building through friendship, through honesty, through the courage of people like Ethan, and the steady loyalty of Naomi was stronger than ever. Mason and I began to fill our days with new routines, new laughter, new traditions that belonged to us. We took weekend walks in the park, made pancakes for dinner, built a life that was in its own quiet way, as public or as private as we chose. As the world's attention faded, what remained was the certainty that we mattered. That standing up even when your voice shakes, even when it makes you the subject of dinner table gossip and internet debate, is always worth it. That healing isn't a moment but a practice, a way of living that starts over and over with choosing dignity. In the soft, ordinary days that followed, I found myself grateful for the storm. Not because it was easy or painless, but because it cleared the air. The family I thought I'd lost was making room for something better, something I would choose moment by moment for myself and for Mason. The next months would bring their own challenges, their own quiet reckonings. But as I watched Mason write his name on the frosted window, smiling unburdened, I knew we were ready. The story wasn't over. It was only just beginning. In the weeks after Ethan's speech and the viral storm, the world outside seemed quieter, but inside the changes rippled through every corner of my life. The Carter family, once held together by tradition, secrets, and obligation, felt suddenly smaller, its edges sharp and unfamiliar. But what surprised me most wasn't the sense of loss. It was the freedom that grew in the empty spaces. Charlotte and Ethan tried to weather the aftermath, but their marriage never truly began. They canceled the honeymoon citing exhaustion, but everyone sensed the deeper fracture. Charlotte slipped from the spotlight her Instagram carefully curated to show only sunsets and salads, never faces. She sent one short message. "I'm sorry you felt hurt," and then nothing more. It stung, but not as much as I'd feared. There was relief in the honesty of her absence, a clarity that let me finally stop searching her eyes for approval. Valerie was less subtle. She called once voice tight with the strain of lost control. "You made a spectacle of us," she said, as if I had written Ethan's words or uploaded the video myself. I listened quietly until her anger sputtered out. For the first time, I didn't apologize. I simply said I can't carry that anymore, and hung up. I expected guilt to follow, but instead I felt light, as if I'd put down a suitcase I never realized was weighing me down. Family gatherings changed shape too. Thanksgiving came and went with no invitations and no awkward explanations. Mason and I made our own feast, spreading a checkered blanket on the living room floor, eating cranberry sauce from the can and laughing over burned rolls. It wasn't the holiday I'd grown up with, but it was warm and honest, free from the pressure of performance or pretense. For the first time, I realized that family could be small and still be whole. My days filled with new routines. I joined a single parents support group at the library, drawn together with other women and men who'd learned to build community from scratch. We swapped stories, some funny, some painful, all real. There was healing in their company, in the way we traded advice about school forms and car repairs, in the comfort of knowing none of us had to pretend. Mason found friends too, and his laughter at these gatherings was different, looser, unguarded, the laughter of a child who knew he belonged. Naomi became family in the truest sense. She helped with school pickups, dropped by for movie nights, and never let a single hard day pass without a text. One Friday, she brought over a just because cake. We sat at the kitchen table, the three of us letting icing stick to our fingers. "This is what family looks like," she declared, and Mason nodded solemnly, as if he'd always known it to be true. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, the ache of what I'd lost still surfaced. I thought of my father, gone too soon to ever witness the unraveling or the repair. I wondered if he'd be proud of me, or if he'd mourn the way our family had changed. But mostly, I found myself grateful for the honesty, for the room to breathe, for the chance to choose which bonds to nurture and which to release. The community support lingered even as the internet's attention faded. I received handwritten notes from strangers, small gifts left at the library's front desk, and the occasional wave of recognition at the grocery store. Some encounters were awkward, others deeply moving. One woman, older and elegant, stopped me at the checkout to say, "You made it easier for my daughter to tell me her truth." Her words landed with a quiet power. I saw then how stories, even painful ones, can be bridges instead of walls. Mason, too, changed in subtle ways. He asked more questions about fairness, about kindness, about why grown-ups sometimes act out of fear. instead of love. One night, as we read stories before bed, he said, "Mom, are you still sad about the wedding?" I thought about it then, answered honestly sometimes, but mostly, I'm proud. Not everyone is brave enough to tell the truth. He nodded, snuggling closer. I think we're better now, he said, and I knew he was right. The greatest lesson in the aftermath was learning to let go of old expectations. Family, I discovered, is not a place you're given, it's a place you build. Sometimes, the ones who are supposed to hold you up are the ones who teach you how to stand alone. And sometimes letting go isn't the end of love, but the beginning of something gentler, something that fits you at last. I saw this lesson mirrored in the support group, where members marked anniversaries not of marriages or holidays, but of bravery. First days at new jobs, first weekends spent alone. First I love yous, said to friends who stayed. Each milestone was celebrated, no matter how small, and I learned to celebrate my own saying no to invitations that felt more like obligations, setting boundaries, forgiving myself for years spent trying to earn love that should have been unconditional. The rebuilding of my family wasn't dramatic. There was no grand reconciliation, no movie-worthy moment of reunion. Instead, there was the quiet work of weaving new connections, choosing every day to show up with honesty and care. There was the joy of ordinary mornings, packing Mason's lunch, watching him run across the schoolyard, coming home to the steady, faithful rhythm of a life built with intention. Looking back, I saw the Carter family for what it was, a chapter, not the whole story. I learned that endings are not always failures. Sometimes they are the only way to make room for something new to grow. The pain of breaking was real, but so was the possibility of beginning again, of finding family in unexpected places. As spring warmed the air and Mason's laughter grew louder, I realized that the future was not something to fear, but to welcome. I could move forward with gratitude for what I'd survived, for the lessons I'd learned, for the courage it took to walk away. The story of my family wasn't over, it had simply changed direction. And as the season shifted, as we planned new adventures and small celebrations, I felt a growing certainty we were at last exactly where we belonged. The next part of our story would be written in the quiet moments, in the laughter around our table, in the choices we made each day to love ourselves and each other a little better. What remained now was the most important lesson of all, and the promise of a life defined not by the pain of the past, but by the dignity reclaimed in its wake. Dignity, I've come to believe, is not a birthright or a prize someone else bestows upon you. It's a quiet, stubborn flame you tend for yourself, a light that grows brighter each time you choose to honor your own story, even when others refuse to see its worth. In the weeks and months after our family's fracture, this became my guiding truth. Some mornings I would still wake with the memory of old slights, a words, a glance, the echo of laughter meant to diminish. But these memories no longer held the same power. Each time I made a choice for myself and for Mason, what we'd eat for breakfast, which holidays we'd celebrate, which traditions we'd create anew, I felt the roots of self-respect reaching deeper. Dignity, I learned, is built in the small, ordinary acts of everyday living. It's there when you refuse to shrink to fit someone else's expectations. It's there when you look in the mirror and see not a failure, but a survivor. I thought once that being loved by your family was the truest measure of worth. The world tells us this in 1,000 ways. Family first blood is thicker forgiveness at all costs. But what I know now is that belonging starts inside. It begins when you accept your own imperfections, when you forgive yourself for the times you stayed silent, when you finally believe you are enough. Family, when it comes, should add to your sense of wholeness, not subtract from it. One evening, as Mason and I sat by the window watching rain streak the glass, he turned to me and asked, "Are we a real family?" The question caught me off guard, as so many of his questions do. I hugged him close and told him the truth. We're as real as love and kindness and laughter make us. It doesn't matter how many people are at the table, only that the ones who are there make you feel seen. He nodded, satisfied, and I saw in his eyes the kind of assurance I wished I'd had as a child. Sometimes dignity is about boundaries, learning when to say no, learning when to walk away, learning that your peace matters as much as anyone else's comfort. It's also about saying yes to new friendships, yes to second chances, yes to letting your heart open again after disappointment. Naomi's presence in our lives was proof of this. Our Friday dinners, our inside jokes, her way of showing up without asking for anything in return, all of these moments rebuilt my trust in belonging, one gentle step at a time. There were setbacks, of course. days when I missed what used to be, when a smell or a song would remind me of easier times before the truth required such courage. But even then, I noticed something remarkable. The pain didn't last as long. I no longer felt obliged to explain myself to those who chose not to understand. When Valerie sent holiday cards with stiff formal signatures, I smiled grateful for the gesture, but no longer hungry for more. Charlotte's absence was simply that, an absence, no longer an accusation. I forgave quietly for my own sake. I let go. Looking back, the journey from silence to self-respect was not a straight line. It was a series of small rebellions, showing up, speaking out, refusing to disappear. The bravest thing I did was to believe, even in my most invisible moments, that I deserved to be treated with kindness. The second bravest thing was to teach Mason the same lesson, so he would grow up unafraid to take up space in any room, at any table. In our new life, dignity is woven through everything we do. It's there in the choices we make for ourselves, the way we treat others, the way we recover from hurt and disappointment. It's there in our gratitude for those who stood by us. Naomi, Mrs. Hargrove, the support group friends, the strangers who sent words of encouragement. It's there most of all in the simple joy we find in each other's company and laughter that doesn't come at anyone's expense. If you've listened this far, if you've seen pieces of your own journey in mine, I hope you take this lesson with you. No one else gets to define your value. You are not the sum of others' expectations or the shadow of their approval. You are whole even when you stand alone. The world will try to shrink you, to press you into roles that don't fit. But dignity means refusing to make yourself small for someone else's comfort. There will be moments, maybe even today, when your courage is tested. You might be the quiet one at the edge of the party, the parent doing it all alone, the sibling left out of the photo. In those moments, remember that your story matters and that you have every right to take up space, to speak your truth, to walk away from what no longer serves you. The real measure of family, of friendship, of love is not how loud or large it is, but how well it makes you feel known. As Mason and I built our new traditions, I realized that freedom is not found in erasing the past, but in claiming the right to write your own ending. Every pancake dinner, every rainy afternoon, every small act of kindness was a line in our new story. A story defined not by what we had lost, but by what we were brave enough to find. So if you're listening, if you're standing at the edge of your own family's celebration, unsure if you belong, let this be your invitation. You are already enough. Your dignity is unbreakable as long as you choose to honor it. Thank you for being here with me, for hearing my story, for sharing your own burdens and victories along the way. If something in these words touched you, please leave a comment, share this story with someone who might need it, or simply carry its lesson forward in your own life. And if you want to hear more stories about ordinary courage and quiet hope, I'd be honored if you subscribed and joined us next time. Our journey is not over, none of ours ever are. But today I stand in the light of my own making, and I hope you find yours too. If you found a piece of your own journey in this story, if you've ever felt small, overlooked, or struggled to reclaim your own dignity, I want you to know you're not alone. Your voice matters. Your story matters. Please share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. I read everyone, and your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If you know someone who could use a little encouragement, send this video their way. Sometimes all it takes is one honest story to help someone else feel seen. And if you want more true stories about resilience, courage, and finding your worth, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Together, we're building a community where every voice is valued and every journey is honored. Thank you for listening, for sharing, and for being part of the story with me. Until next time, take care and keep choosing dignity one day at a time.